Hey guys, before tonight's journey begins, take a little time to settle in. Find the position your body wants to rest in. Loosen anything that feels tight. Let your shoulders drop and let the weight you've carried all day begin to slip away. Tonight, we'll spend a slow autumn morning quietly watching a Victorian woman dress herself, layer by layer, from the first cool garment against the skin to the bonnet and gloves waiting by the door. There's no plot here that you need to keep up with. The story moves at the pace of breathing, meant to gently carry you off to sleep. If these quiet journeys help you rest, we'd warmly welcome you to follow this channel, so that whenever you need it, you can find a night like this again. A quiet like, or a few words left below telling us where you're listening tonight, can help others discover these stories. There's no hurry to do any of that. It can wait until morning, or it can wait forever. Right now, none of it asks anything of you. For this moment, there's only this. The warmth wrapped around you. The night slowly settling in. A long and gentle story waiting to begin. So if your eyes want to close, let them close. Let your breath slow down. When you're ready, we'll step into a cold, quiet bedroom into that last shade of grey before the fire is lit. It's a little past 6:30 on an autumn morning in some English town in the 1860s. And the light outside the windows is still the colour of ashes. In an upstairs bedroom, a young woman has just woken. The fire in the grate hasn't been lit yet. The water in the jug on the washstand feels ice cold to the touch. And over the back of a chair, laid out in the order she'll reach for them, are the many separate pieces of clothing she's about to put on. I'd like the two of us, you and me, to stand quietly in the doorway of that room, simply watching, not rushing her, doing nothing at all, just looking, slowly and up close, at what it really took for a woman of that time to get dressed in the morning, because it was far more involved than we usually imagine. We're so used now to seeing these clothes behind glass, stiff and still on museum stands, that it's easy to forget there was once someone inside them, warm and breathing, standing on a cold floor reaching for the next garment. There were clothes to put on before the petticoat and petticoats before the outer skirt, and between them all, a whole quiet architecture of cloth and ties and tiny fastenings. Some of it she could manage on her own. Some of it needed the help of another pair of hands. That's part of why we've come here. For her, getting dressed wasn't a private stretch of time squeezed between sleep and the day. It was slow, unhurried work, often done with someone else, with a particular order and its own small rituals, carried out the same way every single morning until her hands knew all of it by heart. Every layer had its reason. Warmth, in a house that let the cold seep in easily. Shape to match what the day expected of her. And a quiet sense of what was proper and fitting, worn against the skin in places no one would ever see. I find there's something in all of this worth pausing over. Not the grand story of fashion, but the plain human facts of it. The weight of a skirt, the slow tightening of a lace, the soft feel of warm flannel against a cold arm. If you let yourself lean in just a little, these are things we can almost feel from where we stand. And this lady, whose name we're about to learn, is in no hurry this morning, which suits us perfectly, because we're in no hurry either. So let's begin where her morning begins. In the cold and the grey, before the fire is lit, with the very first thing she reaches for. The room is still dim, or nearly dark, and the first thing she's aware of before anything else is the cold. It sits along the top edge of the blankets, right where her shoulders meet the air. It lurks on the bare wooden floor beyond the little rug, and through the night it has settled into every inch of the room, into the water in the jug, the porcelain of the basin, and the clothes folded over the chair. Everything in the room carries the cold. As she wakes, standing just inside her door, we can feel it too, that still hush a bedroom holds at the tail end of the night, before the day has warmed a single thing in it. Her name is Harriet, and this is her own room, upstairs in a comfortable house in some English town, somewhere near the height of Queen Victoria's long reign. The window has been left slightly open all night, as most windows were, because people firmly believed that fresh air moving through a sleeping room was good for the health, while stale, shut-in air was a lurking danger. So the air she wakes to breathe is fresh, moving and utterly cold. In the grate across the room, wood has been laid, but the fire isn't lit yet. It's stacked and waiting, black coals resting on paler kindling, doing nothing for anyone just now. No one has touched it since last night. That open window is worth looking into more closely, because it came from a real and rather serious anxiety about the air breathed during sleep. Doctors and household writers of the time were convinced that a sleeper's breath, gathering all night in a closed room, would make the air foul and harmful, and they had little experiments to prove it. The advice went that if you left a shallow dish of clean water overnight in a bedroom where someone slept, by morning the water would turn cloudy and spoiled, having drawn in the harmful matter from the air. Whether the water really showed anything, or whether the whole thing was just anxious minds at work, hardly mattered to the habit it created. It meant that many people, Harriet among them, quite deliberately chose to fall asleep in the cold, letting the night wind move freely through the room, rather than risk breathing the foul, warm air of a closed one. That unlit fireplace is also worth pausing over for a moment, because it tells us something about this house and this era. Even in homes that could easily afford the coal, keeping a bedroom fire burning all night was thought a rare indulgence, saved for the sick or the very frail. To wake in a cold room, and to dress in a cold room, was simply the most ordinary shape of the morning for the well-off and the poor alike. Warmth was something you earned as the day got going, not something handed to you the moment you opened your eyes. So for her, the cold wasn't a hardship worth complaining about. It was just the weather of waking, as familiar as her own hands. She had been used to it all her life. For a little while she did nothing. If it were you lying there, you'd know the feeling completely. That small morning tug between the warmth of the covers on one side and the cold of the whole room on the other. In this at least, so many years haven't changed a thing. That reluctance to leave a warm bed for a cold floor is one of those small unadorned truths that quietly connect us to her. Across all the distance of manners and dress and time, she lay still, gathering her strength listening to the sounds of the house. And the house wasn't entirely quiet. Somewhere below and then on the stairs, there was movement. The soft and particular sounds of someone who has been awake for a long while already. A door, a set of footsteps, the dull knock of a coal scuttle set down on the boards. Downstairs, someone was already at work. Before this family had woken, the morning's labour had already begun, and it had begun with the youngest and least seen among them. Before that work reached Harriet's door, it had already taken an hour or more out of someone's day. Waking a cold house and making it fit for a sleeping family was a long string of dirty little tasks, and those tasks fell to the maid, who rose in the dark to do them. There were grates to be cleared of yesterday's ashes, an iron stove to be blackened and rubbed to a shine, and room after room where the fire had to be laid and lit again, each one leaving its mark on a pair of young hands. Only once the heaviest of this dirty work was done could the maid who did it think about washing herself or eating anything. The warm, clean, well-ordered morning this family woke into was really built on hours of cold, soot-covered labour they never saw. Now that work came to Harriet's own door, it arrived in the form of a young maid named Sally, up long before daylight, her hands already turned grey-black at the knuckles from tending the fires downstairs. She slipped quietly into the room, moving with the ease of someone who's done this 1,000 times and will do it 1,000 more. She knelt before the grate. There came the small scrape of the fire irons, the rustle of paper, and the sound of her carefully placing the smallest coals so the flame would catch them best. Her hands moved without a moment's hesitation. I find that, watching her work at the grate, I can't help but think of all the mornings like this one, all those cold dawns that were never set down in a diary or a portrait. Sally's name won't be remembered the way the names of the great and wealthy are, but it was her hands, and tens of thousands of hands like hers, that turned a cold house into a warm home day after day. Their work so quiet that those who woke to see the fire already burning hardly gave a thought to how it had come to be lit. There's a whole history held in that kneeling figure, and most of it was never written down. At least we can give her our attention now for these few minutes she stays here. It's a small, small kindness. The fire is going now. It always gets going in the end. First there's a thin wisp of blue smoke, then a small wavering little flame, and then the low, steady crackle, as the coals begin to give off their heat into the room. Sally stands up, gathers her things, and leaves as quietly as she came, moving on to the next hearth and the next cold room. The warmth she leaves behind spreads slowly, the way real warmth always does, staying at first in a small circle before the fire and letting the farthest corners of the room thaw out on their own as time goes by. Even a modest fire like this one represents a carefully calculated decision. Coal costs money, and in most households, including the well-off ones, it isn't burned without limit or without thought. A fire is lit only at the time and place where it's needed, and never more than that, and the fire lit in the bedroom in the morning is usually left to die out once a person is dressed and has left the room to begin the day. Only in those places lucky enough to sit near cheap fuel in the shadow of a mill or a coal pit can people enjoy a little extra warmth in the early hours. For most people, warmth is measured out by the scuttle of coal and weighed against the price of everything else, and the way a cold room slowly, grudgingly loses its chill is nothing more than a sign of a household using what it has with careful thrift. So Harriet doesn't expect the room to warm up all at once. She knows it will warm gradually, just as she herself begins the first thing of the day, and she has learned to work along with this slow thaw, rather than stopping to wait for it. Meanwhile, Harriet has started to truly stir. She sits up in bed, and here we see the first of the many garments the morning will involve, though this is one she's worn all night long. Her nightgown is a loose, thick, white cotton garment, reaching well past her ankles, with sleeves running down to her wrists and a high plain collar. In the colder months, a nightcap and a pair of soft bed socks are added as well, so that in the depths of winter she sleeps almost as fully wrapped up as she later is when properly dressed. There's a reason for this wrapping, and it isn't only about keeping warm. The clothes worn next to the skin at night, like the clothes worn next to the skin by day, were thought to protect the body and to preserve a person's decency during the private hours of sleep. But at the same time it was deliberately made loose and roomy, so that air could still reach the skin and move gently around it. People of that era set great store by the idea that the skin needed to breathe, and they favoured the sort of nightclothes and bedding that were both warm and loose enough to let the air pass through. Heavy airless wrappings were considered unhealthy, while light airy ones were a small daily kindness to the body. So the roominess of her nightgown, which to us might seem merely modest or old-fashioned, actually held within it a whole quiet theory about health and air and living skin. The bedsheet biases and leaves being a whole small story of its own, a story just as bound up with an anxiety about air. For a long time the great and the well-to-do slept in beds hung all around with heavy curtains, drawn closed at night to shut out draughts and cold. But the very anxiety that pushed people to open their windows also began to turn them against these closed-in beds, for people worried that the drawn curtains would trap the sleeper's own exhaled air around them through the night, sealing in exactly the stale air that fresh currents were meant to carry away. So by these middle years of Queen Victoria's reign, the heaviest old-style bed curtains fell out of favour among those who listened to such advice, and were replaced by lighter hangings, or fewer, or none at all. Harriet's bed is of this newer, more airy kind, open to the air moving through the room, and though this does nothing for morning warmth, it answers to that era's demand for health. She moves her feet onto the little rug, keeping clear of the bare boards beyond its edge, and reaches for a shawl to drape over her shoulders. That little rug does far more than it seems. In a cold room, bare wooden floorboards draw the warmth straight out of the soles of your feet. And even in a beautifully furnished house, the best carpets are kept for the rooms that visitors get to see. The bedroom might have only a plain little rug beside the bed, a warm island in a sea of cold boards, and people would learn, without even thinking about it, to step only onto that and no further until they were ready to face the rest of the room. Now, before the real business of dressing begins, there's the matter of washing. Across the room stands the washstand, with its water jug, its wide shallow basin, its little dish for the soap, its folded towels, and beneath or beside it the pail for pouring away the dirty water. The water in the jug is icy cold. It's been sitting there since last night. As yet, no one has brought up any hotter water. Whether this water is cold or warm is, in a way, a silent mark of a person's place in the world. In a household that could afford to keep servants, the kitchen might send up a can of hot water to set beside the basin, a small little luxury of a comfortable morning. In poorer homes, there was no such thing. In a cold house, carrying water up several flights of stairs, heating it and carrying it up again was energy the poor simply couldn't spare, worn out as they were by long hours of labour and by too little food. So for them, a splash of cold water, or no wash at all, was the hard reality of the morning. If there was a can of hot water, it was one of those small comforts that quietly set one household apart from another. Watching Harriet step up to that basin of cold water, you might find yourself shivering on her behalf. You'd have good reason to, but cold wasn't always unwelcome. In those years, people widely believed that cold water did you good, it woke up the blood, got the circulation going and gave the skin a healthy glow. It was for these very reasons that many chose cold water on purpose, even when warm water was there for the taking. What we might shrink from she treated as a small daily tonic, as a brisk start to the day rather than an ordeal to be endured. The cold water was simply part of the waking up. The washing itself is a careful part-by-part affair, worth watching closely, and it goes a long way toward explaining how a person kept their body private, even while cleaning it. She doesn't strip off all at once and stand naked in the cold room. Instead, she washes just one small part at a time. She works one arm free of the nightgown, dabs a little water onto it with a cloth, dries it with a linen towel, then covers it again before uncovering the next part. The rubbing with a dry towel is itself part of the whole process, thought, to help lift away the dirt and to bring that much-praised warm glow to the skin. In this way she gets through the whole wash, never fully exposing her body and never letting the chill get at her too much. It's a small cleverness of everyday life, a way of being clean and warm and decent all at once, and long habit has made it something she doesn't need to think about at all. Here there's a plain bar of soap with a sharp smell, and its scent hangs in the cold air of the room. In those years, a clean person carrying the smell of soap wore it like a quiet badge, marking them as one of those who washed and looked after themselves, rather than one of the great many who couldn't manage it. Later on, this soap would carry the scent of lavender and rose, but the honest smell hidden beneath was always the soap itself, a smell people had learned to take pride in. In the long view, the whole idea of washing with water every day was still a fairly new habit, and those who kept to it did so with a certain seriousness, as if they were guarding something of great importance. Before she turns to get dressed, there's one small thing in the morning's order still to be dealt with, though it's easily overlooked. The night's clothing and the bed itself can't simply be left as they are. Once she's ready to change out of her nightgown, it will be hung up to air rather than folded away at once. And the bed too will be opened out, the covers turned back for a while, letting the air of the room pass through the sheets and blankets and carry off the warmth and stuffiness that gathered in the night. This airing of the bed, like the washing, was thought to be part of good household care. It was another small daily ritual, serving that same faith in circulating air. It was a habit passed from mother to daughter, hardly ever explained at any length, simply the thing people did every morning because it had always been kept that way. By the time the washing is done, the fire has grown stronger, and that small circle of warmth before the hearth has widened enough to stand in. Harriet stands there for a moment in her nightgown and shawl, drying the last of the wet from her hands, letting the heat reach her at last. The sharpest of the cold is behind her now. The room softens around her. It's no longer the silent, dark, icy space it was when she woke. On the other side of the room, her clothes have been laid over the back of a chair in the order she'll need them, waiting quietly. She isn't dressed yet. She's only warm and clean and awake, standing on the edge of the long, orderly ritual that a Victorian morning asked of a woman before she could be seen. Everything that comes next, the layer upon layer of clothing, the ties and the hundreds of little fastenings, waits for her after this brief pause by the fire. For now, there's only this warmth, the clothes waiting to be put on, and the grey light slowly filling the window. The new day hasn't yet asked anything of her. The very first thing she puts on is the plainest garment she owns. It's a sleeveless undershirt, a simple piece of white cotton, loose and soft, falling from her shoulders all the way down past her knees. She slips it over her head, and it settles around her with that easy comfort peculiar to cloth that's been worn and washed many times over. This garment is like an old friend. It isn't fancy. It has no lace worth mentioning, no trimming, and nothing much in the way of shaping beyond that gentle looseness that lets it hang easily on the body. And yet it is this, in its own quiet way, that becomes the foundation for everything to come, the first and most intimate layer between her and the long morning of dressing that lies ahead. Cotton was almost always the fabric of choice for a sleeveless undershirt, soft against the skin, and it could be made so plain and so cheap that a lady might own several and wash them often. If it were pressed against your skin right now, you'd understand at once why it's put on first. This is the layer that touches you everywhere. It has to be the softest, the most forgiving, and the easiest to keep clean. Every fancier garment that comes after it will rest upon it. The garment itself is very old, far older than the fashionable clothes worn over it. For centuries, no matter what so-called elegance happened to be in vogue in a given age, women had worn some version of this simple linen or cotton undergarment, and its shape had barely changed in all that time. There's something steadying in that. While the gowns worn over it rose and fell with every whim of fashion, this most intimate plain garment stayed almost exactly as it had always been, humble, practical, quietly unchanging. In essence, what Harriet is now putting on is the same garment her grandmother wore, and the same first garment her grandmother's grandmother wore. Fashion is loud and forgetful. The sleeveless undershirt simply carries quietly on. There's something worth pausing on in this pure plainness too. We always tend to imagine that people of the past were forever dressed in finery, in the gowns preserved in paintings and behind glass cases, and we forget the quiet cotton underneath. Even the greatest and noblest ladies of the age usually had the very plainest of intimate undergarments, well cut and carefully sewn, but with no show at all, made soft and comfortable through washing and wearing, rather than dressed up with ruffles. There's a real tenderness in that thought. Beneath all the ceremony of rank and fashion, what a woman most wanted against her sin in the morning was the same thing you want, simply that it to be soft enough, clean enough, and warm enough. It's one of those small human things that flow quietly on across the years. Next come the drawers. These are cotton too, plain and practical, made as two separate legs joined at a waistband, simply drawn in at the waist and tied. To our eyes, there's nothing remarkable about a woman wearing them, but how women came to wear them at all has a small and rather telling story behind it. It's worth taking a moment to tell. When drawers first appeared on women, they were met with a good deal of suspicion. At first, they were thought of as a man's garment, so much like a man's clothing that they seemed quite unnatural on a respectable woman, and some even felt the very idea was improper. Over time, changes in the shape of fashion itself softened that feeling, because skirts grew wider and wider, held out away from the body by huge hoops made of light steel wire and cloth tape. Legs suddenly found themselves out of the warm shelter of those heavy folds. Drawers solved this new problem of drafts very neatly. They gave warmth where the skirt could no longer reach, and they gave a modest, practical covering as well. In the space of a single generation, what had once seemed indecent became both comfortable and ordinary, and even the Queen herself wore plain cotton drawers, many of which survive to this day, soft, washed many times over, and entirely without any showy trimming. It's a fine example of how clothes we now take completely for granted came slowly to be accepted, one practical reason at a time. With the sleeveless undershirt and drawers on, it falls to the stockings to complete the whole foundation of what's worn. Harriet draws them up one at a time, smoothing them along her legs. The wool feels warm in her hands. In those years, most stockings were made of wool, warm, hard-wearing and affordable, though cotton ones were common too. Silk stockings existed as well, but only the few who could afford such a soft luxury ever wore them. The colour of the stockings tells a little story of passing years too. At the start of this century, white had been the fashion. By the middle decades, bright and patterned stockings became all the rage among the young and daring, And then later on, the more sober black began to be widely worn. It's easy to imagine these stockings as ready-made things bought from a shop, but many were still the work of patient hands. Knitting machines had already appeared and could turn out simple stockings by the thousand, yet a great deal of knitting was still done at home, often in the evening by the dim glow of the fire, one stitch after another. And once a stocking was knitted, it was never lightly thrown away. A hole worn through at the heel or toe was not the end of it, but the beginning of its mending, darned across and down with matching thread until the patch itself grew thick over time. A pair of stockings might be mended a dozen times before it was finally past saving. Nothing hard won was ever thrown out. There's a whole quiet economy in that. A world in which the things that took a long time to make were never wasted. All those evenings of careful mending, I find, are rather peaceful just to think about. She fastened the stockings in place with garters, simple bands tied around each leg a little above the knee. There was a small art to this, and a small danger too, because a garter tied too tightly would grow uncomfortable over a whole day, and was thought bad for the legs. Tied too loosely, it would come undone at the worst moment and let the whole stocking slide slack down toward the shoe. I confess I see something very human in her care over this. A good pair of stockings, neatly fastened and smoothly drawn up, was one of those small private vanities a woman might allow herself, unseen by anyone, but a quiet pleasure all the same. To want one good thing next to the skin is, however plain the rest of the clothing, was hardly a Victorian invention. Simply human. It was as natural to her as it is to any of us. Over and through all of this, warmth was the key, because this was Britain, whose damp chill shaped what people wore next to their skin as deeply as any fashion ever did. For most of the year, woolen underclothes were highly prized, and flannel above all was the favourite, since it was one of the cheapest of woolen cloths, and its soft, loosely woven texture held the warmth so well. For many women, adding a flannel petticoat or a woolen vest under the cotton was the difference between a bearable winter and a miserable one. Beyond that, people had a deep trust in wool, believing it a wholesome material to wear against the skin, a cloth that could both let the skin breathe and keep out the chill of the British air. Of course, wool had its faults too. It could itch, prickling delicate skin, and not everyone could bear it directly. Even so, once the wool was on over the cotton, a real warmth finally began to gather around her. You can almost feel it yourself. The chill that had greeted her on waking was now broken up by layer upon layer of soft cloth. The body that had once shivered as it stepped onto the little rug was now warm, wrapped up and comfortable at ease. It's a purely animal comfort, older than any fashion. It's just that simple sense of relief that comes from warmth. This is where those clever little touches of everyday dressmaking quietly come into play, and I find them rather charming. Where the wool met the more delicate parts, a soft cotton band might be sewn along the inner edge as a facing, so that only the softer cloth touched the skin, while the warm wool did its work everywhere else. It was a tiny and clever solution to a small everyday discomfort. It's the kind of idea thought up not in great workshops but at countless kitchen tables, designed by women who knew exactly where clothing would rub the skin and knew exactly how to stop it. There's a whole quiet craft in that, easy to overlook, yet very much to be admired. As the years went on, some women came to take up a garment that joined the vest and the drawers into one, connected into a single long undergarment that covered the body with just this one simple layer. It saved a little time and a little trouble. Where two garments had once been needed, only one was now put on, and it did away with that cold gap at the waist where vest and drawers used to meet. Not everyone liked it, and the separate pieces never disappeared, but it's a fine little example of the endless quiet tinkering people did with these plain garments, always seeking, in the cold of the morning, a little more warmth, a little more comfort, and a little less trouble. Now we come to the reason behind all of this, the plain truth that holds this entire first layer of clothing together. It's easy to think of the sleeveless undershirt, the drawers, and the stockings as merely humble things, worn beneath the finer garments, but their purpose goes far beyond that. A woman's outer clothes of that era, the corset and the gown she was about to put on, were difficult or downright impossible to wash. They had been starched, set, dyed and shaped, and water would ruin them, so when they grew dirty, you couldn't simply wash them and be done. The linen worn next to the skin solved this problem. It took on the body's warmth and wear. It was just plain washable cotton, so it could be changed and cleaned as often as one liked. If circumstances allowed, it could even be changed every single day. In this way, the soft inner layer became a kind of guardian protecting the expensive outer garments, a washable barrier standing between the living body and those clothes that couldn't be washed. This is why a well-run household would keep such a large store of linen. A lady needed not just one sleeveless undershirt, but many, and many pairs of drawers as well, so that when some were dirtied, some were being washed, and others were cleaned, folded, and waiting in a drawer, she always had a clean supply ready. In most households, the washing was done only once a week, and it was long and heavy work. The whole system depended on there being enough clean linen to carry a person through until the next wash. Each garment was usually marked with its owner's initials in tiny embroidered letters, so that it could find its way home from the vast communal jumble of the laundry. Those small letters, carefully stitched in red thread, are among the most touching things left behind in these wardrobes. A quiet signature, a person left upon the plainest thing they owned. And yet, this was not just about practicality, for in those years clean linen carried a heavy meaning. To have undergarments that were clean and white, often changed, and scented with soap was one of the clearest marks of respectability a person could show, a symbol of self-control and decency that needed no words. To walk around in linen that was grey and rarely changed was, in the eyes of that time, to sink among the great mass of the poor and the careless who couldn't manage such things. So the daily discipline of keeping one's linen clean was never merely about comfort. It was about status, reputation, and quietly declaring, I am a person who can look after myself. A great deal of feeling was folded into these plain cotton clothes, far more than their humble appearance might suggest. Even its whiteness carried a certain meaning. White was the colour of the linen worn closest to the skin, and white can hide nothing. It shows every mark and every stain plainly. And so a garment that stayed truly white proved to anyone who saw it that it really was clean. A woman in spotless white linen had nothing to hide. The colour itself became a silent promise of purity and care, and this is why it clung so long to the most private garments, even as brighter colours came and went on the clothes worn over them. These plain clothes didn't appear out of nowhere. Many of them were made at home. Women and the girls spent long hours hand-sewing what was called plain sewing, which meant making and mending the ordinary linen a family wore from the inside out. A young woman might sew a whole set of her own sleeveless undershirts before her marriage, stitch by stitch, patiently closing the seams with the small, even stitches she'd learned in childhood. It was quiet, plain work, done by a window for the light, picked up and set down again between hundreds of other chores. The stitches were small and even. Over a lifetime it built a quiet mountain of cloth, all of it plain, all of it useful, but none of it made to be admired. When I think of the time folded into a single hand-sewn undershirt, I find I can't think of it as humble at all. Seen this way, this quiet foundation of cotton really was rather clever, an extremely sensible system hidden beneath the visible finery. Like so many other things, it relied on the endless, unseen labour of others. For every fresh, clean, sleeveless undershirt laid ready over a chair, somewhere downstairs or in the steaming room of a washerwoman, there were hands that had washed it, wrung it, dried it, and ironed it. It was only because other people spent hours at hot work over the washtub that the ladies could stay fresh and sweet by changing their linen each day. When a stack of clean linen comes into my mind, I often think of them, of all those washerwomen whose names have vanished completely, of their reddened hands that let a whole society wear clean underclothes, yet were never once thanked for it. There's one more thing to say about this first layer, and it's perhaps the quietest point of all. These were the clothes that no one ever saw. The gown she was about to put on and the bonnet were meant to be seen, meant to show the world a person's rank and taste, but the sleeveless undershirt, the drawers and the stockings belonged only to the lady herself. Hidden beneath everything, known only to her, to the maid who helped her, and to the washerwoman who cleaned them. In an age that guarded the female body with so many careful rules, this innermost layer was the one truly private territory she carried with her, soft, plain, and entirely her own. There's something quietly moving in that, a small square of privacy kept at the very centre of this life so full of display. Harriet, of course, thought of none of this. To her, it was simply the morning routine, putting on the sleeveless undershirt, the drawers and the stockings in an unchanging order, each one soft, clean and ready to hand, because it always had been. She stood now in her plain white linen, warm at last. The foundation of the day's dressing was complete. Every piece of this first layer she'd put on entirely by herself without help, showing the pure independence of a woman looking after her own person. It was the last step of the dressing she could do alone, and she enjoyed the moment without hurry. In this quiet moment, she stood in only her softest, most private clothes against the cold, ready for the shaping that was about to come. The next item on the chair was not soft at all. It was the corset, and its appearance changed the whole mood of the morning, for it was the first garment Harriet couldn't put on by herself. She lifted it from the chair, and in her hands she could feel a little stiffness, a shape it held even when no one was wearing it. It kept its own form, and with its appearance another person came into the room. Her maid, Bessie, slipped in quietly to help, as she did every morning, because lacing a corset was absolutely a task that took two people. Before she put it on, let's take a moment to look at the object itself, for it was far more ingenious than it seemed. In essence, it was a garment made of strong cotton, cut into pieces of different shapes and sewn together, so that the flat cloth was cleverly moulded into the curves of the body. A simple homemade corset might be made of only 4 such pieces, with small bits of extra cloth set in to leave room for the figure, while a finer corset bought from a maker might have twice that number, 8 pieces or even more, each seam following the lines of the body. In front there was a stiff long strip called the busk, and behind there were the laces. In the end, it was really a simple idea, a shaped cover of cloth strengthened here and there, then drawn tight with cords. Whether it was comfortable or a misery depended a great deal on how well each part was made and fitted. The cloth itself was chosen for its strength. A good corset was made of strong, tightly woven cotton, sturdy enough to bear the pull of the tightened laces without losing its shape. Set inside it were the shaping pieces that gave the garment its form. Some corsets got their stiffness not from any bones, but from cording rows of stitch channels packed tightly with cord, giving gentle and even support across the whole surface of the cloth. Others were shaped by sewing thin bones along the seams. Formed pieces were set in where the body's curve was most pronounced, to leave room without any pulling. At the back, 2 neat rows of small metal holes carried the laces, so that as Bessie drew the laces from top to bottom, she could bring the whole garment evenly close against the body. It really was a plain piece of engineering, a quiet arrangement of cloth, cord and lacing, all of it meant to gently support the body upright. There was one small improvement worth mentioning, and it changed how tightly a corset could be worn. In the early days, the lace holes were simply strengthened with threads stitched around the edge, and there was a limit to how much pull they could bear before the cloth began to tear. Later, a small metal ring was set into each hole, a tiny brass or steel eyelet taking the strain that the thread had once borne. It seems like such a trifling thing, a metal ring no bigger than a fingernail, but it allowed corsets to be laced tighter and to last far longer. It's a fine example of how the smallest bit of cleverness could quietly reshape an everyday garment. Much of the history of dress is made up of exactly these tiny things. As for its colour, the corset was usually white, just like the plain linen worn beneath it, though as the years passed, soft greys and quiet colours became common too. Even here, in this place hidden from all eyes, that old preference for clean, pure white still remained. The busk of the corset is well worth examining closely, for it lies at the very heart of how the garment holds its shape. It's a stiff, long strip, a bit like a flat ruler, running straight down the very front of the body, slipped into a tight little pocket of cotton made just for it. In a more ordinary corset it might be made of wood, of horn or of whalebone, and as time went on the more flexible whalebone and steel grew more popular because they could bend a little along with the body. Its length was absolutely vital to comfort. If it was too long it would jab and press into the flesh when she sat down, but if it was just right, it would lie snug against her, all through a long day without any discomfort at all. There's something quietly admirable, I think, in that small precision. It was knowledge gathered from long years of wearing, an understanding of exactly how long the busk ought to be for one particular body so that she could sit in comfort. It was a piece of practical wisdom that was never written down, yet was known intimately by every woman who ever wore a corset. Harriet held the busk in place against her chest, and now came the moment when she needed Bessie. She turned so her back was to Bessie, and Bessie took up the laces. The two of them had done this 1,000 times already. They would do it 1,000 times more. This was the everyday teamwork at the very heart of putting on a corset. Two women and a length of cord repeated on every single morning of their working lives. There was nothing dramatic in it at all. Bessie threaded the laces through the eyelets from top to bottom, drawing in the slack a little at a time, easing the extra length downward so the garment settled evenly against her mistress's body. Harriet stood at ease, one hand resting on the bedpost, letting Bessie dress her. Her breathing stayed slow and steady. Of course, not every woman had a Bessie, and we should remember too how a great many women without any maid at all managed on their own. Working women with no maid to help learn to lace themselves, reaching around behind, pulling the cords as tight as they could, or wearing corsets that laced up the front instead. Sisters helped one another, neighbours lent a hand across a shared yard, friends helped friends, mothers laced their grown daughters, and the daughters laced them back in turn. For Harriet it was only a small luxury of service, but for most women it was just one among many household chores shared between them. It was a plain sort of helping out without any fuss, the simple everyday mutual aid of women who had only one another to lean on. It was a small understanding between them that needed no words, this morning ritual so familiar to them both that it hardly called for any speech at all. And if you listen closely, there's a small music in it. The soft hiss of the laces running through the eyelets, the faint creak of the busk settling into place, and a gentle sigh from Harriet as the garment drew tight. These were the most ordinary sounds of a Victorian morning, once so common that no one ever thought to write them down. And now these sounds have vanished from the world, unless someone takes the trouble to imagine them once more. The laces themselves weren't fully unthreaded and relaced every single day. That would have been far too much bother. Instead, the corset was loosened at night and drawn tight again in the morning, adjusting the laces rather than relacing them. So the daily task was one of tightening and knotting rather than starting from scratch. A corset was also something a person settled into and grew into. A new corset felt stiff and unyielding at first, and only softened with wearing, gradually taking on the particular shape of its owner, until at last it fit her perfectly, and only her. A well-loved corset that had been broken in over several months would become as personal as an old pair of shoes, moulded by a one body alone. When a long day finally came to an end, taking it off was a small everyday pleasure too. No matter how comfortable a corset was to wear, there was always a special sense of ease in loosening it at night, a feeling of the day's confinement giving way to the soft freedom of the bed. Harriet knew that pleasure well, as every woman who wore a corset did. The corset was only the companion of the waking day, and nothing more. It belonged to the daytime hours. It was put on in the morning and taken off at night, and that brief sense of release as the laces came undone was its own quiet reward, as familiar and as welcome as the warmth of the bed. I know the word corset tends to call up certain pictures in the mind. We've inherited an enormous legend about this thing, all of its suffocating tightness and breathless suffering. But it's worth setting that legend gently to one side, because for the most part, it is only a legend. A well-made, sensibly laced corset was not an instrument of torture. It was a supportive and actually rather comfortable piece of foundation underwear, worn as a matter of course by women of every class, from the fine lady to the humblest working woman. Those who have made and worn faithful reproductions of the ordinary corset often report that a corset with a modest amount of boning is easier to wear than some of the shaping underwear sold today. It molds the body into a pleasing line, while holding it firmly and gently in place. The truth about the ordinary corset is far gentler and far more comfortable than the stories we've been told. It also helps to understand just how common the thing was. The corset was not the exclusive property of leisured ladies. Women of every station wore it, whether maid, factory girl, farmer's wife, or the mistress of a grand house, each choosing according to what her purse could afford and what her work allowed. Women who spent all day carrying and scrubbing valued its support just as much as those who went out paying calls, for the corset supported the back not only during long hours of sitting, but also through heavy physical labour. Girls too began wearing them from an early age. Their first corset was soft and only lightly stiffened, doing little shaping, only accustoming the growing body to the feel of support. By the time a girl had grown into a woman, the corset was no strange imposition but simply a part of getting dressed, as ordinary as shoes, and nothing to make a fuss about. You could say it was simply the normal state of their lives, and to them there was nothing the least bit strange about it. What the corset mainly offered was support, and to understand why this was so highly valued, we have to understand how that age thought about the body. It was widely believed that a woman's waist and midriff were a delicate and fragile place, that her frame needed a support it couldn't provide on its own, and that the corset was there to provide exactly that support. With its firm shaping at the waist and the back, the corset took on much of the work of holding the body upright, so that standing and sitting straight through a long day became far easier. In a world that placed enormous importance on posture, this was no small matter at all. Slouching was seen as a sign of a lack of self-control, almost a moral failing, while a straight, upright bearing spoke of discipline and decency. The corset helped a woman meet that expectation without effort, and in that sense it was not just a cage, but a quiet ally. The doctors of the time largely agreed with this. It may surprise us, but mainstream medical opinion firmly supported women in wearing corsets, and held that a woman who went without one was just as foolish as a woman who laced herself far too tight. It was thought that a well-fitting, sensibly worn corset protected the back and steadied the frame. It even guarded the body against the damp, cold air of Britain, wrapping the middle of the body in a solid, warm layer of protection. The only thing the doctors truly objected to was excess. The few who laced themselves to the very limit in pursuit of an extremely tiny waist. It was that practice, and that practice alone, that drew the doctors' warnings. As for the ordinary corset worn in the ordinary way by ordinary women, they considered it sensible and good for the health. It served to keep her warm too, and into a cold, damp country that mattered more than we might imagine. Through a long day spent in draughty rooms, a solid layer wrapped snugly around the waist kept the core of the body safe from the chill. People valued this so highly that some took to tying a warm flannel band around the waist for the very same purpose, believing that keeping the waist and belly protected would guard their health overall. To the Victorian mind, the middle of the body was a place that needed warmth, support and protection, and the corset did all three at once. If you could feel for yourself what it was like to wear, you might be surprised. As the laces drew tight, a solid feeling gathered at the waist and back, not a squeezing, but a steadiness, as though a pair of quiet hands were resting against your spine to hold you up. The breathing shifted a little, rising higher in the chest, and the body held itself upright with almost no effort at all. To us, that outer support is a strange sensation, but it isn't unpleasant, and a woman who had grown used to it from her youth would feel a strange sense of losing support without it. In fact, many who set the corset aside for a while found that they missed that steadiness so much that they put it back on with something like relief, because their own muscles had grown used to the help. The body adapts to what it is given. It learns to lean on the help. It would be dishonest to pretend that the extreme case doesn't exist, so we ought to admit it, even if only in passing. There truly was a small handful of much talked about people who, in pursuit of an astonishingly tiny waist, laced their corsets far beyond what comfort or health would allow, and who found in that effort a kind of pride and a sense of belonging. According to the accounts that have come down to us, the discomfort this practice caused was concentrated mainly at the lower ribs rather than at the soft waist, and it was this narrow, extreme fashion that drew the shared condemnation of doctors and moralists alike. But it's important to see it in proportion. This was the striking exception, not the everyday rule, and to judge the ordinary corset by it would be like judging every shoe by the tightest dancing slipper ever forced onto a foot. Harriet wasn't someone who liked to lace her corset tightly. She never was. Her corset was laced for comfort and support through a long day, snug and steady. Bessie knew perfectly well how tightly to pull the cords. She knew exactly where to stop. Folded into this corset Harriet wore, there was a little stretch of history too, that quiet story of change that runs right through this whole sequence of getting dressed. In the earlier years, corsets were often made at home, hurriedly stitched together on the kitchen table by the very woman who would wear them, using a few pieces of cotton and the simplest of supports. It was a plain and practical garment. As the century went on, more and more women turned to buying corsets made by professionals, with their many shaped pieces and their carefully designed boning that hugged every curve. In this shift, something was gained. A better fit, smoother lines, but something quieter was lost too. That homely sense of independence that comes from a garment made entirely by your own hands. This was a small changing of the guard that took place over those years, where in corsets and in many other things, making by hand was gradually giving way to buying. The corset has one last job to do, and this is exactly why so many clothes depend on it. It gives the body a smooth, firm line, and everything worn over it will be built upon that line. The bodice that's about to go on is cut to fit a corseted shape, and it would look strange on any other shape. The heavy skirts will be gathered and hung from the waist that the corset has drawn out. In shaping the body, the corset also shapes all the clothes that follow, and that's why it comes here in the order of dressing, after the soft private linen underclothes, and before all the visible finery. It's the quiet foundation that this whole outline of appearance rests upon. Bessie tied the cords at last, and with a practised hand smoothed the whole garment down, and the shaping was complete. Harriet now stood straighter, supported and held firm, her figure drawn out into that smooth, firm line the age expected. The soft, private layer beneath now had structure. What had once been loose was now held in place. What had once been soft was now made straight. She was ready, on this firm foundation, to put on all the fuller, more splendid clothes still to come. She drew in a slow breath, gradually settling into that familiar feeling of support. Then she turned away from the bedpost and walked toward the rest of the clothes that were still waiting. With the corset on, the building of the skirts could begin, and like so many of these steps in dressing, it started with warmth. The first petticoat pulled on over the corset was made of flannel, a soft woolen fabric, cut shorter so it fell only a little below the knee. Its job wasn't to be seen, but to keep the cold off the legs, and it did that job well and quietly. Worn over it was a white cotton petticoat longer than the flannel one, and this one allowed for a little bit of pretty design along the lower edge, a simple trim running around the hem, because that spot, just possibly, might be glimpsed. And that possible glimpse mattered far more than you might think. When a lady moved about, especially when she was going up steps, crossing a stile, or avoiding a puddle, and carefully lifted her skirt an inch or two, the edge of the petticoat beneath might show for a moment, and so its hem was worked over with a little thought. A row of frills, a line of pleating, or a band of white embroidery along the edge. This was a small vanity, hidden well most of the time, kept just for those brief chance moments of showing. Even in the half-hidden inner layers, there's a wish for something secretly lovely. And that's a very human desire that runs right through these clothes. These plain petticoats, one for warmth and one in white, made up the everyday foundation of the skirts, and women of every class wore them like this all through the Queen's reign. There was nothing grand about them. They were simply a sensible, comfortable beginning to all the fuller dress that came next. But the Victorian skirt didn't just hang down. It stood out, wide and full, spreading away from the body into a great bell of cloth, and that shape had to come from somewhere. For much of the earlier years, it came entirely from stacking, from layer upon layer of petticoats added together, until the outer skirt was pushed out by the combined bulk of them all. If it had been you standing there, you'd soon have felt the weight of it. Each petticoat on its own was light, but 3, 4, or 5 of them together, piled thick around the waist, became a heavy and cumbersome burden to carry through a long day. The longing for a wider skirt only made things worse, because a grander shape meant more layers, and more layers meant more weight dragging at the hips. The dressmakers of that age did all they could to get a better spread with less weight. One clever answer was the corded petticoat, which was the cheapest way to coax a skirt into standing out on its own. It was an ordinary white cotton petticoat with row upon row of stitched channels sewn into it, each channel packed with cord so that the whole garment became stiff and springy, holding its shape without needing much help from the other layers around it. Another answer was a fabric woven through with horsehair, which had wonderful stiffness, lightness, and spring all at once, strong enough that the weight of the skirt above could never flatten it. Both of these were ways of chasing the same goal, carrying a fuller shape more lightly, and both showed that patient cleverness forever at work on the little problems of clothing. The name itself carries a little pleasure too. The word we use for this whole fashion, crinoline, was originally the very name of this horsehair cloth, because it was woven from horsehair and linen, and those two old words were quietly folded into the word we still use today. Long after the horsehair petticoat had been replaced by the steel cage, the name stayed on, and so we go on using a word that essentially means horsehair and linen fabric, to name a cage made out of wire. Names always have a way of outliving the things that gave rise to them, and if you're willing to listen, there's a little whole history sleeping inside this name. Around the middle of the century, the thing that changed all of this appeared. Someone had a brilliant idea to make a cage. It was a simple idea, and a glorious one. Hoops made of fine steel wire were threaded into fabric tapes and arranged in a series of rings, one above another, each a little wider than the one above it, all the rings hanging from a light, thin petticoat. Worn beneath the skirt, this cage pushed the cloth out to its fullest all on its own, and it did that while weighing almost nothing. This thing, called the steel crinoline, spread across the world at an astonishing speed. And it caught on for good reason. On top of all this, the best of these cages held one more little touch of cleverness. Being made of springy steel hoops, the crinoline could be folded almost flat, squeezed together for storing away or for passing through a narrow space, and once released, it would obligingly spring back to its full round shape. There was real ingenuity in this, an enormously wide garment that could shrink itself down again whenever it was needed. The cages also came in different sizes, for different occasions. A moderate crinoline for an ordinary day at home. The widest kind was kept for grand evenings, the moments when a lady wanted to sweep into a room and turn every head. In one stroke, it freed women from the heavy burden of stacking petticoat upon petticoat. Where before 5 or 6 heavy layers had dragged at the waist, now only a light frame did all the work, and beneath it, the legs suddenly had room to move freely that they hadn't had in years. I think we're unfair to the crinoline when we laugh at it. By the time it reached us, it here had become a joke, that skirt swaying like some enormous bell, and it's easy to see it as nothing more than an absurd extravagance. But for the first people who wore it, it was closer to a liberation. Just imagine peeling off 4 or 5 heavy petticoats, feeling the weight lifted from your hips, feeling the air move freely around your legs where before there had only been hot, dragging cloth. This cage was light. It weighed almost nothing. In summers when petticoats used to smother you, it was now cool, and you could buy it ready-made, cheaply enough that not just the wealthy but ordinary women, even maidservants, could own one. That last point is easy to overlook, but it matters enormously. The steel cage was one of the first fashionable products made in the hundreds of thousands in factories, and it cost so little that a silhouette once reserved for ladies of leisure was now within reach of a girl who worked in a shop or a maid on her half-day off. For a brief while, mistress and maid might both go sweeping along beneath skirts of roughly the same width, and there was a quiet sort of equality in that. A grand fashion suddenly made common. The machine age, for all its smoke and clamour, was in exactly this way passing along to ordinary people little pleasures their grandmothers could never have known. However comical it may look to us now, in its own way it became one of those small, quiet kindnesses of the age. At the time it looked comical to plenty of people too. The crinoline was mocked back then no less than it is today, drawn again and again in the comic papers as a dreadful swaying bell that swallowed chairs and small children and filled up whole railway compartments. People laughed at it, argued over it, wrote letters complaining about it. I find something rather comforting in this. It's easy to imagine that people in the past always took all their fashions with deadly seriousness, and when we discover that the Victorians could see perfectly well how absurd their clothes were and laugh at them, and yet go on wearing them anyway, it comes as a relief exactly as we do now. Even so, the cage asked for something in return, and what it asked for was a whole new way of carrying yourself. A skirt held so far out from the body is a very different thing from one that hangs close, and a woman had to learn how to manage it, or she would suffer for it. Sitting down became an art. There was a knack to it. You couldn't just drop straight into a chair, because if you treated it carelessly, the front of the crinoline would fly up in the most alarming way. Instead, a woman learned to gather the cage gently with one hand as she sat, to lower herself slowly and at a slight angle, letting the frame settle around her, so it would fold politely and behave and not make a spectacle of her. She did this 1,000 times a day until it became muscle memory. But again, it was learned, as surely as a child learns to use a spoon. Walking had to be relearned too. That old way of striding straight ahead simply wouldn't do. A great cage swinging between the legs called for a particular gait. A smoother, rounder movement. With each step, the foot turned slightly outward, rather than stepping straight forward. Done well, this gave a woman a gliding sort of grace, as though she were floating just above the ground, the great skirt swaying gently around her. Done badly, it was a business of bumps and near accidents. And here's something worth noting, because that very awkwardness was part of the point. A woman who moved slowly and carefully, a woman who couldn't stride or run or squeeze through a narrow gap, was plainly a woman who did no heavy physical labour. The great skirt, by its very impracticality, announced a life of a certain amount of leisure and a certain social standing. To move gracefully within its limits was to wear one's place in the world. The doorway was where all of this was put to the test, and this is a little comedy of the age that I find rather charming. A skirt at its widest could be nearly as broad as an ordinary doorway, and passing through became a matter that took judgment, a slight turn of the body, a deft little gathering of the cloth, and an instinct for exactly how much space one occupied. Two women in great round skirts could hardly pass side by side down a narrow passage. A wide margin of safety had to be kept from the furniture. As a woman steered her width through a world full of narrow spaces, a whole choreography of tiny adjustments went on all day long without a thought. She knew exactly how much of a room she filled without even thinking about it, the way you know how far your arm can reach. The world beyond the door called for the same quiet skill. Stairs needed care. Going up and down them, you had to lift the front of the skirt with your hand so you wouldn't tread on the hem, or let the cage bang against the banister. Getting into a carriage was a little manoeuvre in itself. The skirt gathered, guided, folded into a space that had never been built to hold it, then let out again to fill the seat. A woman learned to judge the width of a shop door, the gap between two chairs, the room she needed to turn around in a crowded parlour, all of it without a moment's deliberate thought. This bodily knowledge, learned from childhood and carried lightly, is the sort of thing that leaves no trace in any record, yet it filled every waking moment of a life spent wearing these clothes. I feel a strange tenderness at the thought of all that forgotten everyday wisdom, worn as naturally as breathing. There was one danger the cage could never quite tame. That was the wind. A strong gust catching in a wide crinoline could tip the whole structure and lift the skirt in the most unwelcome way. And this was a real and much fretted over danger, because a woman's legs were meant to stay decently hidden. In a way, it was exactly this risk that made drawers so popular, giving a woman a quiet confidence against the mischief of a windy day. So even the weather had to be reckoned with. On a breezy corner, extra care was needed, and a steadying hand on the skirt. The great skirt was magnificent in a still room, and out of doors it was a small adventure. Over the cage went layers meant to soften the line, because if you left the bare crinoline as it was, it would show its ridges right through the outer skirt. So over the crinoline went one or two more petticoats to smooth its line, blurring the rings of the frame into a soft, unbroken curve. Over the corset above went a light cotton cover, a plain, modest garment whose job was to hide the hard lines of the corset and its lacing, so they wouldn't show through the surface of the bodice to be worn next. One layer softened another. Nothing stiff was allowed to show. The hard, clever structures of steel and bone were wrapped in cotton and softened, so the finished figure showed no trace of the engineering underneath, only a smooth and pleasing shape. All of this made work, of course, and most of that work fell to hands like Bessie's. Petticoats had to be washed, dried, ironed, and their frills made crisp again. The cage had to be kept from rusting, and the fabric tapes mended where they frayed. The whole broad apparatus had to be stored somewhere in houses that had never been built for skirts of such width. Cupboards were crammed with them. They took up a great deal of space. A single lady's everyday wardrobe was a little warehouse of cloth and steel, and behind every smooth, effortless figure that slipped into the parlour lay hours of quiet keeping and mending, done by someone whose own dress was far plainer and narrower. As Harriet's things settle into their places, the keepers of all of this finery deserve a moment of our remembrance too. There's another obvious question, which is just how much cloth a skirt this wide devoured. To cover such a wide frame and form the deep gathered folds that the fashion of the time so loved, it took yard after yard of fabric, far more than a narrow skirt needed. That too was part of the quiet luxury of the silhouette. It was part of the expense as well, because cloth cost money, and a great round skirt ate up a great deal of it. It also meant a great deal of sewing, every yard of it needing to be cut, seamed, gathered, and hemmed by hand, or increasingly with the help of the new machines. Beyond all that, a wide skirt stood for a great deal of patient labour, plainly hidden within its graceful hem. Harriet was building herself outward from within. The private linen underneath, the shaping corset, and now this wide, light architecture of steel and cloth, softened layer by the petticoats until it fell in one clean, decisive curve. By this particular morning of Harriet's, the days when the cage was at its fullest and roundest had already begun to quietly pass. The even great bell shape was beginning to change form, drawing in a little at the front and along the sides, swinging its fullness toward the back. And this slowly hinted at the very different silhouette the coming years would bring, with cushions and padding gathering behind. Fashion never stands still, not even within a single garment, and the skirt Harriet wore this morning, before she had quite noticed it, was already slowly evolving toward another shape entirely. She turned in front of the mirror, and the skirt swayed and settled around her, a slow, heavy motion she had known since she was a girl. Bessie stepped back to survey her. She thought it looked very good. The shape had come out now, full, graceful, ready. A woman in a great round skirt has a real presence about her, a way of filling and commanding the space around her. And when she moves, all that cloth sways and stirs with a slow grandeur to it. It has a soft voice of its own, the whisper and rustle of fabric moving over its frame, a sound that once filled every parlour and hallway, and has now almost vanished from the world. Harriet took a step, and the whole wide skirt swayed gently with her lower, and then fell again, both obedient and full of life. The frame was finished at last. All that remained now was to dress it in the clothes the world would actually see. Now we come at last to the garments the world was meant to see. Up to this point, everything had been foundation and structure, the private, shaping, supporting parts. Now what waited on the chair was the dress itself, the thing a stranger passing on the street would very simply call the clothes she was wearing. Before she put it on, it's worth understanding that the daytime dress of this era was usually not a single complete garment at all, but two, a skirt and a separate bodice, made to match and worn together so snugly that they looked like one single gown. This arrangement made a great deal of sense. It suited a world that cared about being practical. A two-piece set was easier to make, easier to alter for fit, and easier to vary, since one skirt could go with several bodices, or a single bodice could be made new again with a change of collar. The dress she put on was really a small set of matching pieces. The skirt, the bodice, and its trimmings assembled on her one by one. The skirt went on first. It was drawn up over the wide cage and fastened at the waist. And as these skirts always were, there was a great deal of fabric to manage. Several yards of cloth hung down from the waistband, gathered thick and full, and it took a moment to arrange so that the folds hung evenly all around and the fullness was smoothed into the deep sweeping drapes that the fashion of the time loved so well. Bessie helped here, moving around her mistress, straightening the folds on this side, smoothing them on that, tugging the hem straight where it trailed along the floor. The skirt was fixed at the waist, fastened with hooks or buttons, and now the wide hem fell properly at last, the visible cloth flowing down to cover all the hidden framework beneath. What had been a bare wire cage a few minutes before was now a river of fabric, and the shape that the whole morning had been working to build was very nearly complete. Then came the bodice. Here the work grew finer and more precise. The bodice was the close-fitting upper half of the dress, shaped tightly to the body over the corset, and of all the garments a woman wore, it demanded the closest fit of all. This is why it resisted factory production for a very long time. The machine couldn't fit itself to one particular body. The manufacturers of that age could make undershirts and drawers and nightgowns by the thousand with machines, plain garments that didn't need to fit closely, but a bodice that had to fit a particular body refused that easy way of making. It had to be cut and shaped to the wearer. And so, for the most part, it still depended on skilled hands, on the dressmaker with her tape measure and her pins and her long experience of how cloth sits on a figure. The bodice was the tailored heart of a woman's dress, the part made for her and her alone. Harriet put it on, sliding her arms into the tight sleeves that ran all the way down to the wrist, for daytime sleeves almost always did, bare arms belonging only to the evening and the grander evening gowns. The bodice sat neatly over the corset and its cover, close and smooth. Now it had to be fastened. This was Bessie's work again, for the fastenings usually ran straight up the back where the wearer's own hands couldn't possibly reach. And in the simple matter of where a dress fastened, there was hidden a quiet mark of a woman's place in the world. A dress that fastened up the back couldn't be put on alone. It needed the help of another pair of hands. Its very design announced that its wearer had someone to dress her, a maid, a sister, or a friend to reach the hooks she couldn't reach herself. A working woman with no such help and no leisure time wore a dress that fastened at the front, where her own hands could manage it. And so the back of a bodice told a small truth about her life. Harriet's bodice fastened behind, and Bessie fastened it there for her, and in that arrangement, without a single word, was written the shape of both their lives. Along the seam up the back ran the fastenings, a long row of small hooks and metal eyes, or a row of small buttons, to be done up one after another, from the waist all the way to the neck. If you have ever had someone fasten a long row of small fastenings up your back, you'll know it asks a particular stillness of you. You stand straight and rather patient, your arms lifted a little, while another person's fingers move slowly up your spine, and there's nothing to do but wait, breathe, and let yourself be dressed. It's a strangely peaceful few minutes. For all its closeness, there's a quiet in it. Bessie's fingers moved from one hook to the next with the certainty of long practice. Harriet stood easily under her hands, and the two of them were wrapped in the small stillness of doing this task together every morning. There was a real intimacy in it, unremarkable and undramatic, just the plain daily closeness of one person dressing another. The fastenings themselves are worth thinking about too. They were terribly fiddly, requiring things that had to be handled with care. A hook and eye was nothing but a small piece of bent wire. Run up the back in a row, they were a small test of patience, each one needing to be caught and closed just so that the bodice could be pulled smooth and even with not a gap left between. Buttons were no quicker, small and close set, and usually covered in the same cloth as the dress, slipped one after another through their hand-sewn buttonholes. In this world there were no quick closures, no long zipper you could pull up a garment with in one movement. Everything was fastened slowly by hand, one small clasp done at a time. A woman's dressing was measured out in exactly these small unhurried motions. This is one of the reasons it all took so long, and one of the reasons it usually took two people. Once the bodice was fastened, all that remained were the small finishing touches at the edges, and these mattered far more than their size. A collar at the neck, a pair of cuffs at the wrists. They were usually separate little pieces of white, designed to be taken off and washed on their own. The reason we've met before, and it runs quietly through this whole business of dressing. The dress itself, with all its fitted cutting and its trimming, was very troublesome to wash, and the collar and cuff sat exactly where the body soiled its clothes most easily, at the neck and the wrists. Making them separate, washable pieces solved this problem cleanly. A woman could keep a fresh white collar at her throat and clean cuffs at her wrists every day, changing them as often as she liked, while the dress underneath could go a long while between washings. A crisp white collar could make a much-worn dress look carefully kept and made new again, a small daily thrift on which respectable appearance was quietly built. I find these little white collars and cuffs one of the most likeable things in the whole outfit. They were so obviously sensible, and so obviously full of hope. A woman with few dresses could ring the changes on them with a change of collar, could lift a shabby bodice with a touch of fresh white, could keep herself neat and clean for very little. Folded into them was a whole quiet art of making do, an art of looking well kept without showing off wealth, and this was the daily lesson of many a woman with far less than Harriet had. A clean white edge at the throat was respectability made visible, and it asked only for a little soap and a little care. With the collar pinned in place and the cuffs arranged, the dress was very nearly complete, and we can see at last what all the earlier trimming and shaping had been for. In these particular years, this was an age that loved bold and lavish decoration. Plainness was not the fashion. Restraint could be left to another era. The finish of the dress was decorated with braid, fringe, and contrasting edging, sewn with rows of buttons that fastened nothing, and ribbons added purely for the look of them, all of it piled on with a cheerful, unrestrained attitude. In its own particular way, this was a confident and lively moment in the world of dress, unafraid to show off a little. Some of this abundance had a machine to thank for it. The sewing machine had recently arrived, and it changed what a dress could be. Before, every seam and every trim meant long hours of stitching by hand, but a machine could finish a seam in minutes. And that meant decoration, once so costly, suddenly became cheap and plentiful. Rows of pleats, braid, ruffles and flounces, which used to take days of labour, could now be run up in a single afternoon. Dresses blossomed with all kinds of trimming, not just because fashion loved it, but because the machine had made it possible. The richest still had the finest finishing done by hand, but now even an ordinary dress could carry a great deal of decoration. It's a wonderful example of how a new machine can quietly reshape the look of an age. Harriet's morning dress was far plainer than the fanciest of those garments. It was meant for an ordinary day spent at home, but it too had its own decoration. A band of braid around the hem, a row of covered buttons down the front of the bodice for ornament, a few small things that were pleasant to look at. Over these years, the colours of the age were changing too. New dyes had recently been discovered, giving cloth colours it had never had before. Bright purples, vivid greens and startling pinks of an intensity that no plant or root could ever have produced. For a time, these bold new colours were the height of fashion, worn with obvious delight by women who had grown tired of the softer, paler shades of earlier days. Not everyone admired them. Some found this new brightness too harsh, almost jarring. but they were the excitement of the moment, and they belonged to that same style that so confidently loved to show off and pile on the ornament. Harriet's daytime dress kept to a warmer, quieter colour, just right for the mood of morning, but all around her was a brighter world. There's another point worth mentioning, and it's simply that this was her morning dress, the first of the day, not the last. A woman with a little leisure did not wear the same dress from waking to sleeping. Different parts of the day had their own matching dresses. The morning hours spent quietly at home had their plainer gown. An afternoon walk or a visit called for something a little more refined, and the evening, with dinner and company, called once again for something grander. Changing 2 or 3 times a day was, for a woman like this, simply a way of marking time, each part of the day bringing its own outfit in turn. To us it sounds like an enormous undertaking, and in a way it was. But this labour was mostly carried by the maids, who fetched the clothes, fastened the buttons, and put things away. And for the mistress it was just a comfortable rhythm of living. This morning dress that we watch being put on would be set aside by the afternoon, and the whole patient process would begin all over again. Her eyes felt pleased, for a well-made dress that fits brings a real and simple happiness, and that pleasure hasn't changed at all over the years. Standing before the mirror, wearing a garment that hangs just right, the shoulders fitting well, the waist smooth, and falling to the floor in a lovely line. It's a small, quiet satisfaction that any of us would recognise at once. This particular shape may look a bit strange to us now, that tightly laced little waist and that huge trailing skirt, but the feeling beneath it is completely familiar. She turned a little, this way and then that way, watching how the skirt moved. She thought it looked very good. Whatever else had changed, that small warm pleasure of being well dressed had never changed. Hidden inside the dress she wore was an unseen history made of many hands. Somewhere a dressmaker had measured her, cut the cloth to her figure, fitted, pinned, stitched, and made this bodice fit as smoothly as it did. The skill needed to make a very well-fitting bodice was considerable, a true craft that took years to learn. And this work of making clothes for other women was how a great many women earned their living. When Harriet stood so pleased before her mirror, she stood inside the fruits of hands she probably rarely thought about. A quiet, expert labour that turned lengths of cloth into something shaped to the body is one more unseen presence folded into the morning's dressing, and it's worth pausing on here before we go on. A good dress was usually not the end of the story, for a well-made garment had a long life ahead of it. As fashion changed, a dress might be taken apart and made over into a newer style, its cloth too good to waste. A worn dress might be turned inside out, its faded outer layer unpicked and reversed, showing the fresher cloth underneath. A good gown might pass over the years from mistress to maid, and from maid to her own family, growing plainer and shabbier with each pair of hands, until at last the cloth ended its days in a humbler form. Something as costly as good cloth was never thrown away lightly. Every yard of it had been made to last. A dress was not a thing of one season, but a small inheritance, altered and remade over years and through many hands. And in an age when cloth was expensive, that too was part of what it meant to be dressed. There's one small mystery left, and it's a thing people often wonder about. In all that cloth, where did a woman keep her things? The answer is that the dress itself had almost no pockets, because a bulging pocket full of keys or coins would spoil the smooth line that fashion prized. Instead, a woman usually wore a separate pocket. A small flat bag, tied at the waist and hidden under the skirt, reached through a slit in the folds of the dress. Or she carried a small handbag in her hand. It's a small thing, easy to overlook, and yet it shaped 100 little moments of the day, reaching for, taking out, and putting away the small necessities of life. Even where the keys were kept was something quietly arranged by the shape of the clothes. Now that the dress is on, there's one thing well worth weighing in the literal sense of weighing. Taken all together, these clothes a woman wore were not light. The linen underclothes, the corset with its bones and busk, several petticoats, the steel cage, yards of outer skirt, the fitted bodice full of trimming. All of these together made up a real daily burden of cloth and steel worn on the body from morning to night. A woman thought nothing of it, because she knew no other way to live. But the sheer weight of dressing was considerable, most of it hanging at the waist and hips. The corset played its part here, spreading out that weight and supporting the frame that carried it. Even so, to be dressed in the fashion of the time meant carrying a great deal about the body, all day, every day. By comparison, we pass our morning so lightly, and it makes us stop for a moment to marvel at how she once carried all of this without complaint. She's now fully dressed, or very nearly fully dressed. The foundations have been laid, the shape has been built, and the outer dress has been put on, fastened and trimmed. The collar and cuffs fresh and clean. That first figure, shivering in a plain nightgown, has now become a woman dressed in the finery of her age, shaped into the smooth and grand outline that the age asked of her. Only a last few things remain, those little outer touches that would carry a woman from her bedroom out into the wider world. For now she stands before the mirror in her finished dress, turning slowly in the growing light. The room around her is warm and bright now, the grey dawn has turned into full morning. In this quiet moment she is simply letting herself become fully and completely dressed. Now that she's dressed, let's do a thing we haven't yet done properly. Let's stop looking at the shape of the clothes and think instead about the cloth itself, its real substance, about the thing her fingers touched and her body knew all day long. A garment is not just a shape, it's a texture, a weight, a warmth or coolness against the skin, and the whole experience of being dressed depends as much on the feel of the cloth as it does on its cut. This is the experience of dressing that no picture can ever show us, and it's worth taking slowly. Let's begin with cotton. It was the great everyday cloth of the age, the fibre from which most of her clothes were made, whether she knew it or not. The sleeveless undershirt next to her skin was cotton. So were the drawers, the petticoats, the cover over the corset, and even the backing that her woolen or silk dresses relied on for support. Cotton was everywhere, and for good reason. It was cool, light, and gentle on the skin, stood up to washing again and again without complaint. And above all, it was cheap, costing perhaps only a third of the price of good wool and only a tenth of the price of silk. It was this cloth that let people stay clean, since it could be washed freely, and it was this cloth that let ordinary people dress decently. And cotton could be pretty too, which mattered even more than pure usefulness. The machines that spun it had also learned to print on it, running length after length of plain cloth through engraved rollers, printing flowers, stripes, and scattered sprigs of colour. Once, printed or patterned cloth had been an expensive thing, and now a working woman too might own a delightful printed cotton gown, dotted with little flowers, bright, washable, and within her means. It was one of the small democratic gifts of the age, colour and pattern, once the preserve of the rich, now made within reach of ordinary people. In those rolls of printed cotton, a great deal of quiet happiness was bought. Cotton had a plain, honest goodness about it, and if you rubbed it between your fingers, you could feel it at once. A smooth, soft, unpretending cloth that asked for nothing and gave a great deal. Right next to the cotton is linen, its older cousin, woven from flax fibres rather than from the cotton plant. Linen has a personality all its own. It's cool, crisp, and smooth, with a faint natural sheen, and with every washing it only grows softer and more comfortable, until an old linen sheet or an old linen cloth becomes one of the most pleasant things a body can ever touch. It was treasured, used to make the finest underclothes, the best bed sheets, and those collars, cuffs, and handkerchiefs that needed a little crispness to please the eye. Linen clothed people for far longer than cotton did, and though the cheaper cotton was fast overtaking it, those plain washable garments worn next to the skin were still called in the old way and rather tellingly the linen, no matter what the cloth was truly made of. A name once again outliving the very thing that gave it birth. Wool is another matter entirely. To understand it, you have to feel its weight. Cotton is light and cool, but wool is warm and heavy, and in a cold, damp country that warmth is worth its weight in gold. A good piece of woolen cloth has a density to it, a substance you can feel in your hand, and the thickest winter wool is packed so tight it can almost stand up on its own. Thick as felt, stiff from close weave. To put on a woolen dress is to feel the day settle more firmly around you. To be wrapped and held and kept warm for hours on end in a drafty room. Wool has a smell all its own too. A faint, animal, reassuring smell that rises up gently when it's warm or damp. How wool feels depends a great deal on how it's woven. A plain weave makes one kind of cloth, while a twill weave, with its fine diagonal ridges, makes another that's stronger and hangs better. Some cloths are brushed once they're woven, to raise a soft nap on the surface that feels warm and a little fuzzy to the touch. Those sturdy, hard-wearing cloths that clothed working men and women, the heavy fustians and coarse canvas of the world of toil, were cotton woven and finished to be as tough and warm as could be. The same handful of fibre then could become 100 different cloths depending on how it was spun and woven and finished, and a skilled hand could read all of it in a moment's touch. It isn't always the gentlest cloth, for it can prickle against bare skin, which is why you wore soft cotton underneath it. But for keeping you warm, nothing else comes close, and on a raw morning when a woman reached for a heavy woolen gown, she reached for it with real gratitude. Silk is the cloth of luxury, the thing most women could only look at and long for. Silk might cost 10 times what cotton did, a price beyond the reach of an ordinary purse, so simply to wear it was to announce that you held a certain standing in the world. Nothing else could compare. Silk is cool, smooth, and a little slippery to the touch, sliding over the fingertips like water, and it catches the light in a way absolutely no other cloth can match, with that soft, shifting shimmer that seems almost alive. And it has a sound, a soft sound. The particular rustle a silk skirt makes as it moves, that light, crisp whisper, was one of the signature sounds of the age, a sound that announced a woman of some means before she ever came into view. To move in silk was to be accompanied by that soft, rustling music, and one can well understand why women coveted it so, quite apart from its cost and its status. Worn on the body, it was simply a beautiful thing. I think it's worth pausing here to consider just how much these three cloths shape the whole texture of life. A woman back then knew cloth with an intimacy we've largely lost today. By touch alone, she could tell the quality of a length of cotton, the trueness of a piece of wool, the weight and grade of a silk, because these were things that mattered, things saved up for, chosen with care, and worn for years. We now buy cloth so cheaply and so carelessly that we can hardly imagine how much weight a good length of cloth once carried in the hand and in the family purse. To her, cloth was precious, and its feel was a language she spoke all her life long. Because it was precious, it was given real and careful attention. A good dress was not simply worn and washed, but tended between wearings too. Brushed free of the dust it gathered, sponged clean of any mark it took, its creases smoothed and its folds hung straight. Woolen garments were guarded closely against moths, stored away with sprigs of lavender, or with cedar and camphor, whose sharp, clean smells were thought to be hated by those little pests. And so the wardrobe had a scent all its own, one we'd know at once if we could open one now, the smell of clean cloth, soap, lavender, and cedar, faint, cool, and orderly. Freshly washed linen carried the particular sweetness that comes from drying out in the open air. New cloth had a smell of its own, old worn cloth had another smell again. A woman lived her whole life among these quiet smells, half noticed and half not. The smell of her own clothes and her own wardrobe, as familiar and unremarked as the smell of her own home. Stains were coaxed out slowly with patient household remedies, each cloth having its own well-known way of being handled. All this care took time and a knowledge, most of it a woman's or a maid's, which meant that a well-kept garment might serve for many years. We'd find it an enormous bother now. To her, it was simply how you looked after a thing of value, as natural as any other piece of housework. Her wardrobe changed too as the year turned. When the cold came on, out came the heavier wools, the thicker petticoats, and everything warmer, and when spring returned, the lighter cottons took their place. This changing of the wardrobe with the seasons was a real event in the household, a time of airing and mending and putting away, of folding winter clothes carefully against the moths and bringing summer ones back out into the light. In dressing for the day, and in a wider sense in dressing for the season, a woman knew without a second thought which cloths belonged to the cold months and which to the warm. The true feel of the year was written whole in the weight of the clothes she wore. Cloth ages too, as all things do. A woman knew its signs well. Colour faded where the light struck it, and a much-worn dress grew paler at the shoulders and in the folds the sun caught. Cloth wore thin where it was used most. At the elbows, the cuffs, the hem, and the seat. A garment carried its whole history in its cloth, the marks left by the bodies that wore it, and the years it had lived through. A much-loved dress gone soft, thin, and faded was not a ruin at all, but something gentler, a settling that comes with long use. There's a quiet companionship in a garment worn for years, worn until it knows you, a companionship we scarcely know now, since so little of what we wear these days is made to last. But where did it all come from? This cotton and wool and silk that wrapped her round. This is one of the great, quiet stories of the age, and it deserves to be told because the cloth on her back was the product of one of the largest changes the world had ever seen. Not so very long before, cloth was made slowly by hand, spun into thread on a spinning wheel in a farmhouse and woven on a loom, a hard living that made every yard of cloth dear. Then the machines came. Everything changed. Great mills rose up in the towns of the north, filled with steam-driven spinning frames and power looms that poured out cloth in numbers and at prices the world had never known before. The cotton that made her chemise was, in all likelihood, spun and woven in one of these vast northern mills, amid the roar of the machinery, by the hands of a woman who would never see the one who'd one day wear it. And the raw cotton itself came from far away, carried across the oceans in great ships, brought from lands she would never see, unloaded at the docks, and then sent inland to the mills. Folded into her plain white chemise was a whole hidden map, a long journey of fibre, from distant fields, across the seas, through the roaring mills of the north, and at last to a quiet bedroom and a woman's morning. We think of these clothes as small local things. In truth, the whole world was already woven into them. To think of that cloth is to find it impossible not to think of the hands. The cheap, plentiful cotton that let ordinary women stay clean and decently dressed was made by other ordinary men and women, and even children, working long hours in the heat, the noise, and the cotton dust of the mills. Folded into the softness of that cloth is a hard truth, that one person's comfort rested on another person's long labour, and to praise the one without remembering the other would be dishonest. That chemise lying so softly against Harriet's skin began its life in a place of endless din, with someone whose own life was far harder than hers tending the machines. I say this not to spoil the quiet of the morning, but because these are the facts, and those hands deserve a moment of our thought as much as anyone in this story. That age took enormous pride in the making of all this, and it put that pride on grand display. Around the middle of the century, this nation gathered its industrial goods beneath a vast roof of glass and iron, threw open its doors to the world, and held a great exhibition showing everything the machine age could produce. Cloth of every kind was there, roll upon roll of it, cotton and wool, silk and printed calico in a dazzling array of colours and patterns, each manufacturer competing with the others to show how fine and how cheap the cloth they could now produce had become. Hundreds of thousands, millions of people came to marvel at it. They had never seen anything like it. In its own way, it became precisely a celebration of the cloth on Harriet's back, a celebration of a world that could just now dress itself in bright, cheap, plentiful fabric, and a celebration of the machines, the factories, and the unseen hands that made it all real. Let us come back from the factories and the exhibition halls to the simple fact of the cloth on her body this morning, because there is one last and most important thing to say about how it feels. Cloth does not just cover the body. It also shapes the way that body moves. This is easy to forget. A heavy woolen skirt sways and falls in its own slow way. A stiff piece of silk holds its shape and rustles with every step. A soft piece of cotton follows the body closely and quietly, and the wearer, even without realising it, adjusts her movements to suit the cloth she's in, walking a little differently, sitting a little differently, holding her own posture to match the weight and drape of what she wears. Those who put on precise recreations of clothing from this period and go about real work discover this again and again. The clothes themselves teach the body a particular set of movements, making some things easy and graceful and others clumsy, until a person, without even knowing it, moves in the way the clothes prefer. This is a subtle thing, and when you really dwell on it, it's a rather beautiful thing too. It means the people of the past didn't just look different from us. They moved differently. They carried themselves differently, and the way they lived inside their own bodies was shaped by the cloth they wore, in a way we can now only partly imagine. That particular grace the women in these clothes had, the slow turn, the gathering of the skirt to sit down, the gliding walk, wasn't affectation, but simply the natural way to move in such cloth. Her clothes and her body had reached a long, quiet agreement with each other, and the feel of the cloth was its terms. Harriet stood there in cotton and wool, and perhaps a little finer fabric too, warmly covered and supported, the whole weight and texture of her clothes as familiar to her as her own skin. She didn't think about how they felt, any more than we think about the feel of our own soft, light, comfortable clothes. It was simply the cloth of her life, the material she woke and put on, moved about in and lay down to rest in, spun and woven and sewn by 100 hands she would never know, and now worn on her body without a second thought. Here is one last small thing I love to think about. A woman in the dark, without a single glance, could recognise her own clothes by touch alone. Her hand fell on the right fastening, could tell the smoothness of silk from the roughness of wool, and found the collar and the cuff by feel. After long wearing, the clothes had almost become an extension of the body itself, known not with the eyes but with the hands and the skin, in that deep and wordless way we know the few things we touch every day. This is perhaps the truest measure of how close cloth once was to life. It was known in the dark by the heart and by the body. The feel of it was the feel of her whole world, and in it she felt completely at ease, and there is a whole world of dressing to go out that we have not yet touched. Until now, everything has been for her to wear indoors, in the quiet hours at home, but to step out of her own front door, a woman needed more. An outer set of clothing that completed the whole figure and made it fit to be seen on the street. This is the final finishing that we now turn to. As it happens, none of it begins with a garment at all, but with the hair. Before the bonnet could go on, the head had to be arranged, so the hair was dressed first. Harriet's hair was long, as all women's hair was, for it was rarely cut short. Just arranging it was a task in itself, every day. The hair was combed out, then drawn smoothly back from a centre part, gathered at the nape of the neck, where it was coiled into a bun and pinned in place, held with scattered hairpins, and perhaps covered with a fine net to keep it neat. Bessie did this with quick, deft hands. She had done it on countless mornings already. There was a particular tiny sound to it, the soft click of the pins, the smooth stroke of the comb, and sitting still to have one's hair done required a particular quietness too. When it was finished, the head looked clean, tight, and orderly. Now it was ready for the bonnet that would frame it. Now to the bonnet itself. It was the crowning piece of the whole outfit. It was a shaped, pretty thing, worn set a little back, framing the face just so, the brim curving along the cheeks, held by a pair of ribbons tied in a soft bow beneath the chin. In the warm months, a bonnet might be of light woven straw, cool and paler in colour. In the cold season, of felt or silk, trimmed with ribbon, and perhaps a curl of feather or a few artificial flowers. Some had a veil that could be pulled down over the face against the sun, against the dust, or simply to shield one from a stranger's gaze. To us, this careful covering of the head might seem a small vanity, but it was far more than that. A respectable woman did not go out bareheaded. To do so was almost unthinkable, and only the poorest or most careless would be seen doing it. The bonnet was not merely an ornament, but a hard requirement of decent dress in public. The head, like the body, had to be covered, and a woman on the street without a bonnet would feel as undressed as if she had no gown. The bonnet was also something a woman made and remade herself, and there was a whole small economics wrapped up in this. A good bonnet was not bought lightly, so people refreshed it and remade it rather than replacing it, swapping the ribbons, taking off the trimmings and adding new ones. An old bonnet with just a length of new ribbon and a few hours of patient work could be brought back to life for a new season. Retrimming a bonnet was a common evening pastime and a knack every woman had. Over these years, fashion was changing too. The bonnet that hid the face deeply began to give way to smaller hats worn higher and showing more of the face. And this was especially clear among the young. It was the first sign of the more playful headwear the coming decades would bring. But for a woman like Harriet, on an ordinary morning, this kind of bonnet was still the plain, proper choice, and so she put it on. It's worth noting that the colour of a woman's whole outfit might also be decided for her by the customs of that age. When a family suffered the loss of a loved one, the women of the house would wear black for a long time afterward, as a quiet outward mark of mourning whose depth and length everyone understood. Wearing black was a solemn and formal matter, and a household would keep some dark clothes in reserve for when they were needed. Harriet was not in mourning this morning, so her clothes kept their warmer colours. A woman's clothes spoke not only of her place in society, but of the different stages of her life. The same wardrobe held both bright garments and dark ones, ready for the different weathers of the years. Next came the gloves. This too was a tiny daily ritual worth watching. Harriet put them on one hand at a time, working each finger into its proper place, letting the leather or cotton slide smoothly over the knuckles and drawing it up to the wrist. A good glove fit closely. Putting on gloves was a small, unhurried business, not to be rushed. Like the bonnet, gloves were more than mere nicety. A lady going out without gloves was as impossible as a lady going out without a hat. Gloved hands were part of the language of decency, and they carried a special meaning too. Gloves kept the hands white, soft, and unscarred, and white, soft hands were a mark that a woman did no manual labour. A working woman's hands, made rough and red by toil, could not be hidden, while a lady's gloves quietly declared that her hands belonged to another kind of life. In this world, what a person wore said a great deal, and smooth kid gloves said a great deal in just a few inches of leather. For that same care of white, unblemished skin, in the sunny months a woman carried a parasol when she went out. The parasol was a small light thing, a little silk canopy on a slender handle. It was useless against real rain, and was never meant to keep off rain, only to keep the sun off the face. For a pale complexion, untouched by wind and sun, was seen as another mark of a lady, a sign of a life lived away from the fields and the harsh sun. A woman who could keep her face out of the sun was a woman who did not need to labour in it. The raised parasol, like the gloves and the bonnet, quietly told of the kind of life its owner led, sheltering a fashionable paleness that was itself a kind of declaration. It was a small thing carried in the hand, yet it held a wealth of meaning. Over the top of all of this, some kind of outer garment had to be thrown on, both for warmth and to make the whole outfit complete. And here, that enormous skirt made its own demands. The kind of fitted coat a woman might wear today simply wouldn't work over so vast a crinoline. There is no coat in the world cut wide enough to fit over the outside of it. The outer garment had to be loose, a thing of drape rather than close-fitting. And for most women, the answer was a shawl or a loose cloak. The shawl in particular fitted this shape perfectly. It solved the problem all at once. A great square or triangle of cloth folded and thrown across the shoulders fell softly over the wide skirt without fighting against it, warm and elegant at the same time. The finest of these shawls were things of real beauty, and I find them among the loveliest garments of that age. The shawls woven with a swirling teardrop pattern, the pattern we now call Paisley after the little town that became famous for making them, were treasured possessions. Soft, warm and glowing with intricate colour, handed down, kept carefully, and worn with real pride. A good shawl might be one of the finest single things a woman owned, saved up for and loved for a lifetime. In the coldest weather there was also a muff, a soft tube of fur or padded cloth into which the hands could be pushed to keep them warm, hung on a cord around the neck. There is a particular comfort and delight in a muff that I think we've lost entirely now. On a bitterly cold day, pushing two frozen hands into soft fur. That deep animal warmth. It kept the hands warm where gloves couldn't, and left them free to be pulled out in an instant when needed. On a bitterly cold morning, it must have been one of the few real, small comforts of being out and about at all. To put a shawl across the shoulders was to put on a small masterpiece of the weaver's art, and anyone could feel at once the quiet pleasure of its weight, its warmth, and its beauty. For the poorer women, the shawl wasn't one choice among many. It was often the whole of their outer clothing, the only warm thing standing between them and the harsh weather. A plain wool shawl wrapped tightly and pinned in place did the work of the rich woman's cloak muff and fine coat altogether. And in the bitterest weather, when even a shawl wasn't enough and there was nothing warmer to put on, a resourceful woman might tuck a folded newspaper inside her clothes to keep out the wind, because paper keeps in warmth surprisingly well. There is something in that small detail that touches me. There is both the cleverness of it and the hardship behind it. A woman using yesterday's paper to keep out the cold because that was what she had. The same shawl that was a precious luxury to one woman was the barest necessity to another. And as always, the cloth on the shoulders told the whole story of a person's life. At the very bottom of the shape were the boots. Indoors, a woman might wear light, soft shoes, but to go out she needed something sturdier. Boots that laced or buttoned at the ankle were the usual choice. The buttoned boot was a small marvel of the age, and it came with a tool of its own. Down the side of each boot ran a row of little buttons, too small, too close together, and too stiff to be done up by fingers alone. So there was a button hook, a slim rod with a little hook at the end, made for exactly this. You'd pass the hook through the buttonhole, catch the button, and pull it through one after another up the ankle, until the boot closed snugly on the foot. It sounds like a fiddly business, and it was, but done every day it became quick enough, and the little button hook became as much a part of getting dressed as the boots themselves. If you've ever fastened a long row of anything with a small tool made just for it, you'll know that tiny satisfaction, the crisp, certain click of each button being pulled into place. Once the good boots were on, there was the question of keeping them whole. The streets of a Victorian town were not the clean, paved surfaces we know. They were often thick with mud mixed with horse dung, full of all the wet filth of a place where everything moved by hoof, foot and wheel. To bring all that dirt indoors on your boots was unthinkable, and to ruin good leather in it was a real expense. A woman going out in bad weather might slip a pair of overshoes over her boots, the newer rubber galoshes, or the older kind of raised iron ring that lifted the foot up above the worst of the standing water. Coming home, she'd take them off at the door, keeping the good boots inside clean. This is one of those small arrangements that modern paving and well-drained streets have swept away entirely, and we never think of it now, though once no woman could step out into a muddy morning without it. Rain needed its own answer, quite different from the parasol that was only for keeping off the sun. To deal with a wet day, a woman would carry an umbrella, just as we do now. There were newer defences too. The age had recently learned to make a cloth that could keep out water, treated with rubber to shed the rain. This waterproof was a real blessing in a rainy country, though the early ones could be stiff, stuffy, and carry the faint smell of the rubber that made them waterproof. With a stout umbrella, a waterproof, and a good pair of overshoes, a woman could keep herself and her clothes tolerably dry in the worst weather the British sky could offer. And the British sky offered plenty of bad weather. In a climate like that, keeping it dry was already half the battle won before you'd even set out. With the boots buttoned, she was dressed. Now truly and fully dressed. From the plain linen next to the skin to the bonnet on her head. From the boots on her feet to the gloves on her hands and the shawl on her shoulders. Before going out, there was a small bag to take. A woman carried her few necessaries about with her. A handkerchief, a little money, perhaps a card or a small purse, held in a small bag carried in the hand, since her skirt gave her almost nowhere to keep such things. It was a small, pretty, useful thing chosen to go with the dress, and it completed the whole picture of a woman ready for the street. Inside were the small necessities of a day, ready to hang on her wrist or be carried in her hand. Every layer was in its place. The whole long, patient work of the morning was done. The woman who not long before had been shivering with cold in a dark, chilly room was now ready to step out into the world dressed, complete and perfect, with not one fastening out of place. Before the door opens, let us stand with her for a moment before it, for in this pause on the threshold there is something worth feeling. Behind her is the warm private room. Behind her is the whole quiet ritual of dressing. Before her is the street, the daylight, the world of other people and their eyes. What she wears is, in a sense, the bridge between the two, the careful armour of respectability that lets her step from one world into the other. Every woman who has ever paused before a mirror before going out, checked herself, drawn a deep breath, and then reached for the door, has known this tiny moment, and Harriet knew it, now. Not one bit of this has changed. The clothes are different, the world beyond the door is different, but the moment itself, that last small gathering of oneself before facing the new day, is exactly as it always was. Bessie gave her one last look as she did every morning, running a practised, quick eye over her, from bonnet to hem. She straightened a ribbon. She smoothed a fold of the shawl. She carefully picked off a stray thread. Then she stepped back, satisfied. Her long morning's labour on her mistress was over at last. This was the same small ritual of every day, this last inspection and letting go, and there was in it a quiet care that went beyond mere duty. One woman, with her own two hands, dressing another from the inside out. Before the door opens, spare a thought for this simple fact. She would repeat all of it tomorrow, and the day after, and every day of her life. This whole long ritual we've watched, the linen and the laces, the cage and the skirt, the bonnet, the gloves, and the buttoned boots, was no special occasion, but the ordinary shape of every dull morning. It was put on, taken off at night, and put on again over and over, year after year, with such thorough patience that it was never even thought of as patience. There is a quiet dignity in it, in that willingness to arm oneself day after day, carefully layer by layer, simply to meet the new day with decency. It's easy to call such a life dull. I'm not sure the word is quite right. In all that unnoticed, faithful, daily labour of dressing, there is something steadfast, something worthy of respect. She reached for the door handle. Her morning was about to begin, her gloved hand closed round it. Under the leather it was cool and smooth, and we'll leave her here dressed, ready, and entirely herself, standing on the edge of her morning while a whole ordinary day waited quietly beyond the door. We have watched one lady dress herself slowly and splendidly through one long morning. She stands for only one way of dressing, and by no means the most common one. In the same town on the same cold morning other women were dressing too, in ways so different that they might have belonged to another world altogether. Let us leave Harriet at her door and take a little time to look at them, for the whole truth of dressing lives just as much among the plain and the poor as it does among the fine. Let's start downstairs in the very house we've just left and go and see Sally the housemaid, the one we saw at dawn kneeling in front of the bedroom fireplace. There was nothing long or ceremonial about the way she got dressed this morning. It was a short and simple business. It took only a few brief minutes in all. There was no maid to lace her up. There was no leisure time to fuss over herself. There was no wide cage to hold out her shape in the room. She rose in the cold and dressed quickly and plainly, with work waiting for her and no time to lose, and a quick plain dressing was all her life allowed and all it required. A sleeveless shift, a plain pair of stays she laced herself at the front, a petticoat or two, a plain printed cotton dress, and over the top the apron and cap that marked out her trade. In a few minutes she was dressed and ready to meet a day of hard work. Her whole wardrobe, if we can even call it that, was very small and very simple. A housemaid might keep everything she owned in a single box. A few plain dresses, her aprons and caps, her underthings, one good outfit for her days off and for Sundays, and nothing more beyond that. There were no cupboards crammed with gowns for every season, no drawers stuffed with choices. What she had chosen with care, and looked after with care, because it had been bought out of a small wage and had to earn its keep. For Sally, dressing wasn't a matter of choosing from among many things. It was putting on the few things she owned. And when you think about it, there's even a kind of quiet in that plainness, a kind of life that isn't troubled by the endless choices that fill our own. That apron and cap are worth a word or two. They were the badges of who she was. The apron showed its purest, most practical meaning. It was a broad protecting cloth tied over the dress to keep off the dirt and the wet of the work, so the dress underneath could be spared and kept decent for longer. But the cap and apron together were also a kind of uniform, so anyone could tell at a glance what she was. A servant ought to look like a servant, neat, clean, plain, and never to be mistaken for her mistress. In a well-run household, even the maid's own dress had a rhythm to it across the different hours of the day. In the morning, for the heavy, dirty work, she wore her plainest printed dress and a rough, working apron that could stand up to the grime of grates and floors. Later on in the day, once the heavy work was done, she might change into a darker, neater dress with a clean white apron and a fresh cap, so she could decently answer the door or wait at table. So even a servant had her own morning dress and her own afternoon dress, faintly echoing in her own humbler key, the way her mistress changed her clothes through the day. In many households there was a real anxiety about all this. If a maid dressed too well, too close to fashion, it upset the proper order of things, and so the servant's finery was kept firmly within its limits. This came out most clearly in the matter of old clothes, and there's a small story worth telling there. A mistress would often pass her old dresses down to her maid, and that really was part of how a servant came by her clothing, but this kindness was rarely as generous as it sounds. A dress that was too fashionable, if it were passed down just as it was, might make the maid look above her station. So such dresses were usually altered first, their bright trimmings taken off, their bold lines made plainer, cut down into something a servant could decently wear. In other words, the fine dress came down the stairs, but when it came down, it was plainer and quieter than when it had gone up. Its finery had been taken apart along the way. There's a great deal you can read out of that small act of unpicking. The whole order of society was spoken through what people were allowed and not allowed to wear. Now let's step out of the house into the town and the wider countryside, where the ways of dressing become far more varied. A working woman dressed first and foremost for work, and her work left no room for the sort of wide cage that Harriet wore. You can't scrub a floor or tend a fire all day, or work in the fields, with a hoop as wide as a doorway holding you out. So a working woman's skirts were narrower, and often pinned up out of the wet and the dirt. Her sleeves were pushed up, and her whole outfit was made for use and not for show. It was practical, sensible clothing, and there was a plain dignity in it, the dignity of clothes made to be worked in rather than to be looked at. But nearly every woman, however hard her life, kept one good thing. The Sunday best was a real and cherished tradition, a decent outfit kept aside just for Sundays and for the great days of her life, for going to church, for weddings, for christenings and for funerals. All week it was carefully hung and kept safe, and only brought out on a Sunday. A woman who wore rough working clothes 6 days out of 7 would come out on the 7th in her good clothes, clean, neat and proud. It might be the one fine thing she owned. She kept it like a treasure. It was guarded and it was mended, and made to last for years, and there's a quiet dignity in that keeping of one good garment for the days that mattered. I find there's something very moving in it. That determination to have one good thing to wear at the crucial moments, whatever else you might still go without. In many places, women also wore the clothing peculiar to their own corner of the country, for this was still a world that was a patchwork of local custom. In a fishing village, the women might wear thick quilted petticoats, a style that had been in fashion 100 years before and had never gone away. In another place, they favoured a strong striped wool woven nearby and red shawls, a look known and shared by the whole community. Wherever the cheap, bright printed cottons from the great mills could easily reach, the women wore those, and in the places that were harder to reach, the old local cloth held on. To wear the clothes of your own home was to belong there, to be known at a glance as one of your own, and there was a warmth in that belonging, a warmth that would be slowly worn away by the uniform fashions of later years. Think for a moment about the completely different feel of it all. While Harriet's mourning was wrapped in the cool slipperiness of silk, or the fine soft cotton of good linen underthings, what lay against a working woman's skin was a coarser cloth, a thicker, heavier, tougher wool made to stand up to hard use rather than to please the hands. It could be warm, it could be good honest cloth, but it hadn't the softness that money could buy. This was the most basic difference between those two mournings, and the one the body felt most directly, moment by moment. The rich woman was wrapped in softness, the poor woman was wrapped in toughness. Each of them was so used to what she wore that she barely felt the difference between the two. The one wouldn't marvel at her silk, and the other wouldn't complain of her wool. Since it wasn't bought from tailors and fine shops, then where did all these working women get their clothes? Many bought them second hand, and this trade in used clothing was enormous, far greater than we might imagine. Every big city had its own second-hand markets, whole buildings and fairs given over to the buying and selling of worn clothes. The range of it was astonishing. At the very top were the barely worn old clothes of the rich, fine cloth with hardly a stain on it, passing through the trade into the hands of people who could never have afforded such good clothing brand new. At the very bottom were the truly worn and mended things, patched, turned inside out and remade, worn again, going right on to the end of a long working life. A working family often clothed itself entirely from this river of second-hand cloth, and there was nothing shameful in that, because it was how most people dressed, and keeping such clothes clean was a labour in itself. A poor woman might own too few clothes to change them often, and when the water has to be carried and heated yourself and there's work to be done every hour, washing clothes is a very hard thing. Yet many kept themselves clean against all the odds. They scrubbed, they mended, they made the most of everything. Because the decent poor prized a clean appearance just as much as anyone above them, and often had to work far harder for it. Good cloth was far too valuable to be wasted. It passed from one body to another, down through the ranks, step by step, till at last it was worn away to nothing. Alongside this old trade in used clothing, something new was rising in these years. The making of ready-made clothes, cut to standard sizes and sold brand new but cheap, was growing quickly, and shops selling ready-made clothing were opening up one after another. A working man or woman in steady work could now buy a new coat or a new dress off the shelf at a price that had never been possible before, without waiting for a tailor or searching through a second-hand stall. It wasn't the finest cloth, and it didn't fit as well as clothes made to measure, but it was new, it was affordable, and it put new clothes on the backs of many people who had never worn anything new in their lives. Between the second-hand market and the ready-made shop, ordinary people had more ways than ever to dress decently. Standing between the grand house and the second-hand market was the maker of clothes, and we should stop here, because she is the last figure of this morning and one of the most important. Her name was Mrs. Larkin. She ran a small dressmaking shop in Cheswick Lane, and it was hands like hers that sewed the clothes for most of the women in this country. Because the fine shops and the great fashion houses served only a few, most women never set foot in them. Most of the clothes in this country were made by local dressmakers in their little shops, one garment at a time, cut to measure for each particular woman who came to their door. Mrs. Larkin's mourning was unlike Harriet's or Sally's. For no one but herself did she dress, plainly and quickly, yet in a sense her day would be spent, with her measuring tape, her scissors, and her long and patient craft, in making clothes for others. A lady came to her to have a dress made. Mrs. Larkin measured her, wrote it all down, talked over the fabric and the cut, and then began the long and careful work of turning a flat length of cloth into something that would fit a living body. It's a true craft learned over many years, to read a person's shape and coax the cloth to follow it, and it was also the way of life for many women who had no other skill to earn a living by, besides needle and thread. This wasn't always an easy living, and for honesty's sake we must gently point it out. For every seamstress who had her own little shop and lived in comfort, there were many women who sewed for long hours for meagre pay. They bent over their work by candlelight late into the night, their eyes tired and their fingers aching, scraping by on needle and thread alone. The beautiful clothes of that age rested, to a very great degree, upon a mass of just this kind of unseen and poorly rewarded labour. I dwell on this not to bring sadness to this morning, only to keep it in mind, for these women too were part of the great invisible work of clothing the nation, and they deserve to be remembered in this moment, right there among all the others. There was another way this work was done, one I find rather charming. In many households, the seamstress didn't work in her own shop, but came to the home. This was a travelling sort of dressmaker, who came to stay for a few days and took over a room. She took charge of the parts that needed skill, the cutting and the fitting, the parts that called for her trained eye, while the women of the house, the mothers and daughters, did most of the plain sewing under her guidance. For a while, the house became a little workshop full of pins and cloth and quiet busyness, a season's worth of clothes taking shape around the table. There's a warmth in this picture, the women of the house and the seamstress sitting together, sharing the work of clothing a whole family, and a very large part of the nation's clothing was made in just this way. For Mrs. Larkin and for countless women like her, a great deal of the work wasn't making at all, but mending, making do, and remaking. Unpicking a dress and turning it inside out to hide where it had worn thin, letting down a hem for a girl who had grown taller, letting a bodice out or taking it in as the body changed over the years, turning an old gown into a newer style, cutting a worn-out skirt down into a child's clothes, snipping a good piece of cloth from a garment beyond saving and keeping it by to patch another. This quiet, never-ending work of mending and making over was the real everyday business of most people's clothing, far more than the making of anything new. It went on forever in every house in the land by the fireside in the evening. Let's end this morning by placing these two figures side by side. The woman in silk and the woman in coarse frieze wool, dressed so differently on the very same cold day. In a world like that, a person's whole place in society could be read at a single glance from her clothes. The cut of a bonnet, the fineness of a shawl, the softness of a glove, even the way a skirt was spread out or looped up. All of it told a trained eye at once who this woman was and where she stood. In an age like ours, when so many of us dress so much alike, we've largely lost that old language. But to Harriet's world it was plain speech, read by everyone without effort. A woman carried her social standing wherever she went, written into the cloth for all to see. Between them lay a wholly different world. One was ease, the other toil, one was leisure, the other haste. One was a long ritual, the other just a few short minutes. It's easy to see only the distance between them and to stop there, but that isn't all of it. In the end, I find myself drawn to what they had in common. They both rose in the cold and put on clothes against it. They both met the very same grey morning. They both wished to stay clean, decent and warm, doing their best to meet the new day. They both knew the feel of cloth against the skin. They both understood that small comfort of being wrapped in clothing. Beneath the silk and the rough wool were two women who were not so different, after all. Both of them doing the oldest, plainest thing a human being can do, simply dressing against the chill of the morning and stepping out to meet whatever the day would bring. By now the whole little town was full of light. The sun fell at the same time on the grand house and the humble one, on silk, on cotton, and on rough striped wool. In every corner of the town women were dressed and ready, stepping out into the day, each in the clothes that life had given her, each carrying herself into the morning in the only way she knew. And so the morning's preparation was over, and the lady we've been watching stepped out into her day, layered and lessed and ready in the clothes we now know inside and out. Before we let her go, let's linger a moment longer over all we've seen. The plain cotton close to the skin, the firm support of the stays, the wide light hoops, the trailing skirts, the fitted bodice with its little clasps that needed patience to fasten, The bonnet, the gloves, and the buttoned boots by the door. A whole quiet building made of cloth, slowly put together morning after morning just so that one woman could meet her day. And behind it all were those hands. I keep thinking back to the hands that made this morning possible, most of them belonging to people whose names were never written down. The young maid who rose in the dark to light the fire, the washerwoman who laboured over the steaming tub so a whole household could have clean linen to wear, the unseen workers in the far northern factories, and the seamstress bent over her needlework by candlelight. So much of everything we've seen rested upon their silent labour, and I think it's right to take a moment to keep them in our hearts. These tens of thousands of people who clothed the world, kept it warm and cared for it, while asking so little in return. Now let the picture soften and slowly fade, coming gently back to yourself, wherever you happen to be lying and listening. Tonight you don't need to lace or button or fasten anything. Whatever you're wearing, it's soft, light and comfortable, and the warmth around you is entirely your own. This too deserves a quiet gratitude, in your own night, in your own in bed, enjoying this simple comfort, with nothing at all left to do. If, in that long morning, one small detail has stayed with you, the click of a hairpin, the rustle of a skirt, or the plain white collar kept fresh with a little soap and care, I'd love to know. If you like, you could leave a few words below about the moment that stayed with you, or simply about where you're listening tonight. There's never any hurry, it can always wait until the morning. This is a small and quiet channel, and its whole purpose lies in just this, to tell the slow, plain, forgotten stories of ordinary days long gone, and to let them carry you gently off to sleep. As time goes on, we'll wander into many other mornings, into medieval kitchens and old streets, into the small everyday lives of people in every age. If these quiet journeys are a comfort to you, you're warmly welcome to stay, to follow along, and to join us in slowly enriching this series of peaceful nighttime stories, one evening after another. You've spent this evening here, and that means a great deal. But none of that is for now. Right now there's only warmth, darkness, and the night settling slowly around you. The morning we've been watching ended long ago. The lady is long gone, and there's nothing left for you to do but rest. Let your breathing slow. Let this long day set down its weight. Good night and sweet dreams.